Have you ever thought about how incredibly easy it is to disappear? I do not mean packing a bag in the middle of the night, leaving a quick note on the kitchen counter, and driving off into the dark. I mean disappearing right in plain sight, right in front of people. Fading into the busy background of a fast world until you become just another shadow on the hot pavement. We see people every single day, the tired cashier at the grocery store, the old man sitting alone on the park bench, the quiet neighbor watering their dry lawn, but we do not really look at them. We look right through them. We assume their lives are as quiet and as ordinary as they appear on the surface. But sometimes that quietness is a heavy mask. Sometimes the most ordinary, overlooked people are standing right on the edge of a dangerous cliff, fighting a terrifying war that nobody else can see. 3 days after she vanished, the only person who actually noticed was not her family, 'cause she had none left. It was not a friendly neighbor, and it certainly was not the local police. It was a rough, quiet man, a man who had never even spoken a single word to her. And by the time the rest of the oblivious world realized that something was terribly wrong, the shocking truth behind her sudden absence would reveal a chilling reality. It would reveal that this quiet, frail old woman, the one everyone simply ignored, had been living a life far more dangerous and far more terrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. The year was 1998. The month was August, and the place was Blackwood, Texas. If you have never been down to West Texas, in the dead, unforgiving middle of summer, it is hard to truly explain the kind of brutal heat that settles over a town. It falls over the houses like a heavy, suffocating blanket. It is the kind of intense, relentless heat that distorts the horizon, making the cracked asphalt shimmer and dance like boiling water. The air is always thick, incredibly dry, and it constantly smells like baked dirt, hot metal, and old exhaust fumes. Blackwood was a place that the rest of the fast-moving world had mostly forgotten. It was a dying, rusted railroad town, full of empty, dark storefronts, shattered sidewalks, and tired people who were just trying to survive until the sun finally went down. Life moved very slow here, not by a conscious choice, but because moving fast simply took way too much energy. In a small, fading town like this, people strictly minded their own business. It was an old, unspoken rule of survival. You keep your head down, you do your daily work, and you absolutely do not ask any questions about the closed doors of your neighbors. This deep isolation, this ingrained, stubborn culture of always looking the other way, was exactly what made Blackwood the perfect place to hide. And tragically, it was exactly what made it the most dangerous place to be left completely alone. At the very edge of this dying town, where the ruined pavement of Elm Street finally surrendered to the unforgiving, endless desert dust, stood a fading yellow house. The old paint was peeling away in long, brittle strips, curling off the dry wood like dead skin. The front yard was a sad, defeated battlefield of stubborn weeds and dry, yellowed grass long abandoned to the harsh, burning Texas sun. It was a house that looked deeply exhausted, a house that looked like it was slowly, quietly sinking into the dry earth. And inside this forgotten house lived Martha Vance. Martha was 74 years old. Her face was a detailed map of deep, weathered lines, etched by decades of hard physical work, unspeakable emotional grief, and a quiet, unrelenting endurance. She was a very small woman, fragile in her physical appearance, with thin shoulders that bowed slightly under the invisible, crushing weight she constantly carried. To the casual passing observer, to the speeding cars and the distracted pedestrians, Martha was just another sad, lonely widow. She was a quiet ghost, haunting her own fading life, simply waiting out her final empty years in absolute silence. People had their own wild theories about her, of course. Small, bored towns always do, because people always need answers when none are given. Some folks whispered that she had lost her mind after her husband passed away years ago. Others simply assumed she was just bitter, choosing to stubbornly shut out a modern world that had moved on without her. But nobody actually knew her. Nobody ever stopped their car to ask her how she was doing, and Martha never offered a single fragile word of explanation to anyone. She preferred it exactly that way. The less they knew about her, the safer they all were. Despite her heavy isolation, and despite the crushing heat, Martha had a strict daily ritual. It was a physical routine, so precise, so incredibly consistent, that you could literally set your watch by it. Every single morning without fail, no matter how oppressive the heavy air was, and no matter if her old joints ached with the dull, biting pain of arthritis, Martha would step out onto her front porch at exactly 8 o'clock. She would stand there for a brief, quiet moment, her thin, veined hand resting lightly on the weathered, peeling wooden railing. She would take a slow, deep breath of the warm, dusty morning air, her sharp eyes scanning the empty, sun-baked street from left to right. And then she would begin her deliberate walk. It was a slow, measured march down the cracked, uneven concrete path, her worn leather shoes scuffing softly, rhythmically against the loose gravel. She would walk all the way to the very end of her driveway, where a rusted, battered metal mailbox stood leaning heavily on a rotting wooden post. She would reach out her thin, trembling fingers, carefully grasping the hot metal handle, and she would pull the small door open. The rusted hinges would always let out a sharp metallic squeal, a harsh sound that cut sharply through the quiet morning air like a knife. She would peer deep inside the dark, empty cavern of the metal mailbox, lingering there for a few long, incredibly quiet seconds. She never received any actual mail. There were never any letters from old, forgotten friends. No cheerful postcards from distant relatives, and no bills that had not already been meticulously settled. The metal box was always empty every single day. Yet she would look inside, her weathered expression completely unreadable, her jaw tightly set with a quiet, fierce determination. And then, after those few seconds passed, she would gently close the metal door, turn her frail body around, and make the slow, painful walk back to her fading yellow house. To the oblivious people who happened to drive by, this daily repetitive trip to the mailbox looked like the sad, desperate act of a deeply lonely old woman. They truly thought she was clinging to a meaningless habit, hoping for a fragile connection to a busy world that had completely forgotten her. But they were wrong. They were entirely dangerously wrong. Martha was not waiting for a letter. She was not hoping for a friendly visitor. This slow walk, this precise, unyielding daily routine was not a sad symptom of loneliness. It was a calculated, desperate, and brilliant alarm system. It was a silent, desperate plea, a clear message broadcasted loudly to a world that was simply not paying attention. She knew that her dark past, a violent, terrifying past that did not even belong to her, was slowly, steadily catching up. Her late son, Tommy, had left behind a dangerous legacy, and she knew that the ruthless people who were looking for his buried secrets were closing in. And she knew, with terrifying certainty, that if they finally came for her, they would do it quietly. They would snatch her in the dark. They would make her disappear into the vast, empty desert, and no one in this sleepy town would ever know. So she made herself visible. She forced herself every single day into the daily landscape of the dusty street. She became a fixed, reliable point in a moving, distracted world. Because she figured if she made herself a permanent, expected fixture of the early morning, someone somewhere might just notice if that fixture was suddenly violently gone. She was not walking to check the mail. She was walking to prove she was still alive. She was simply waiting for the terrible day the routine would finally break. And 3 days ago, the rusty door of that mailbox had remained tightly shut, while the rest of Blackwood, Texas slept heavily or simply ignored the harsh world around them. One man did not. His name was Cole Bennett. Cole was 42 years old, a man built entirely out of hard labor, quiet, unspoken regret, and thick, stubborn motorcycle grease. He was not a man who blended easily into the background. He was a large, imposing figure with broad shoulders, heavily tattooed arms, and a thick, dark beard that hid most of his weathered face. He lived a rough, solitary life. He was a lone wolf, surviving on the very fringes of a town that was already falling off the map. To the people of Blackwood, he was just the gruff, silent mechanic who fixed their broken trucks. They brought him their failing engines. They paid him in crumpled, dirty cash, and they quickly left his dark, hot garage. Nobody stayed to chat. Nobody asked him about his day. And Cole, burdened by his own heavy demons, preferred it exactly that way. Cole spent his long, agonizing days inside a suffocating cinder-block garage on the north side of town. The air inside that old shop was always heavy, thick with the sharp, bitter smell of burned motor oil, stale sweat, and old exhaust fumes. The brutal Texas heat trapped itself under the rusted tin roof, baking the stained concrete floor until it felt like the inside of a massive oven. Most men would complain about the intense, draining heat, but Cole did not mind it. In fact, he welcomed the harsh physical discomfort. The exhausting labor, the bruised knuckles, and the constant stinging sweat kept his racing mind firmly grounded. Working on broken, shattered engines gave him a sense of control. He could take a machine that was completely dead, take it apart, piece by broken piece, clean it, replace the bad parts, and bring it back to roaring life. It made sense. It was a simple, logical puzzle with a clear, undeniable solution. But human beings, Cole knew all too well, were not like engines. You could not just swap out a broken part and expect a person to run perfectly again. When a human life broke down, it shattered completely, leaving behind sharp, dangerous edges that cut anyone who tried to help. The roar of his custom-built chopper was the only truly loud thing in Cole's lonely existence. He rode a heavy black modified motorcycle, a powerful machine that shook the dry dirt beneath its massive tires. He built it himself, using scrap parts, salvaged metal, and countless sleepless nights. Riding that bike was his only true escape. When he was on the open, empty highway, with the hot desert wind rushing violently past his ears, the deafening sound of the heavy engine drowned out the dark, haunting voices in his head. But the moment he cut the engine, the moment the heavy silence returned, the ghosts came rushing back. His eyes, dark and deeply tired, were always sharp, always moving, always scanning his quiet surroundings. He noticed the very small, subtle things that everyone else simply walked past. He noticed the slight nervous shift in a customer's step. He noticed the tight, fearful clenching of a stranger's jaw. He noticed the heavy, exhausted slump of a tired mother's shoulders. He noticed all of these fragile human details because once upon a terrible time he had failed to notice them. This was the heavy, crushing burden that Cole Bennett carried every single day. It was an invisible, suffocating weight that sat squarely on his chest, making it hard to take a full, deep breath. Years ago, Cole had a younger brother. His name was Sam. Sam was a bright, energetic kid, full of wild dreams and a desperate, burning need to belong. But Sam was also deeply lost. Growing up rough without a solid, loving foundation, Sam started looking for a family in all the absolute wrong dark places. He fell in with a bad crowd, a dangerous, violent group of young men who promised him fierce loyalty, but only delivered chaos, pain, and destruction. Cole, older and supposedly wiser, was supposed to protect him. He was supposed to be the heavy anchor that kept his younger brother from drifting into the violent storm. But Cole had been too busy, too entirely wrapped up in his own rough, chaotic life to see the glaring warning signs. The signs had been there, obvious and terrifying, if only he had actually opened his eyes. There were late-night panicked phone calls that Cole simply let ring into the dark. There were strange, unexplained bruises on Sam's face that Cole casually brushed off as boys being stupid boys. There was a sudden chilling shift in the young boy's eyes, a loss of innocent light replaced by a deep, frantic fear. Cole had completely ignored all of it. He told himself it was just a passing phase. He told himself Sam would eventually grow out of it, that he would figure it out on his own. He believed with foolish, naive arrogance that he had plenty of time to fix it later. But time is a cruel, unforgiving thief. By the time Cole finally woke up, by the time he finally realized the terrible, violent truth of what Sam was involved in, it was far too late. Sam was gone. He was taken violently and permanently by the very darkness that Cole had stubbornly chosen to ignore. That massive, catastrophic failure completely broke Cole. It shattered his very soul into 1,000 jagged, painful pieces. It fundamentally changed the man he was. It turned him from a loud, reckless young man into a quiet, haunted ghost. The crushing guilt ate at him, chewing on his conscience every single hour of the day. He punished himself constantly. He pushed away his few remaining friends, isolating himself in the dying town of Blackwood. He lived a life of strict, harsh penance. He even pushed away his own daughter, Sarah. She lived 3 states away now, growing up without a father. Cole wrote her letters, long, deeply apologetic letters, pouring his broken heart onto cheap, lined paper. He kept them all in a dusty shoebox under his narrow bed. He never actually mailed a single one. He firmly believed he did not deserve her love, her time, or her fragile forgiveness. He felt he did not deserve any peace, not after failing his own blood so completely. This tragic, bloody history is exactly why Cole watched the world so intensely now. His profound guilt made him hyper-aware of his quiet surroundings. He could not save his own brother. He could not protect his own family. So he subconsciously watched over the oblivious strangers around him. It was a compulsion, a desperate, silent need to prevent another tragedy. He constantly looked for steady patterns in the chaotic world. He watched people's daily routines, their quiet habits, their predictable movements. And more importantly, he looked for sudden breaks in those familiar patterns. He refused to ever be blind again. He stubbornly refused to let another vulnerable person slip away into the dark shadows while he was looking the other way. He promised the ghost of his younger brother that he would always keep his eyes wide open until every single morning, and as the blazing Texas sun began its slow, cruel climb into the empty sky, Cole would kickstart his heavy chopper. He would ride the exact same route, rumbling loudly down the cracked pavement of Elm Street. It was the only direct road from his small, hot trailer park to his dark, cinder-block mechanic shop. And every single morning without fail, his sharp, tired eyes would scan the dying houses along the way. He watched the stray dogs searching for shade. He watched the old men sitting on their porches, and he watched the dry dust blow across the empty yards. He noticed everything. And because he noticed everything, because he was desperately looking for the tiny details that the rest of the busy world ignored, his eyes eventually found the fading yellow house at the edge of the desert. He noticed the broken concrete path. He noticed the rusted metal mailbox. And most importantly, He noticed Martha Vance. The connection between them did not happen overnight. It was not a sudden dramatic moment of realization, and it certainly was not born out of a friendly neighborhood introduction. In a harsh, dying place like Blackwood, Texas, trust was a very rare, very expensive currency, and neither Cole Bennett nor Martha Vance had any to spare. Their bond was forged slowly, forged in the heavy, oppressive silence of the desert mornings. It was built on quiet observation, a slow, steady accumulation of shared moments that eventually turned into an unspoken, ironclad ritual. It was a connection between two deeply isolated people, two lonely ghosts haunting the same forgotten stretch of cracked pavement. Every morning, just a few minutes before 8 o'clock, the quiet atmosphere of Elm Street would be violently torn apart. The deep, guttural roar of Cole's custom chopper would echo off the empty storefronts and the peeling paint of the dying houses. The massive V-twin engine of his motorcycle did not just make a sound, it made a physical feeling. It was a heavy, rhythmic vibration that you could feel deep in your chest, rattling the loose window panes and shaking the dry dust off the dying weeds. Most of the remaining residents of Elm Street hated that terrible noise. They would hide behind their closed, yellowing blinds, muttering angry curses into their stale coffee cups, wishing the rough, intimidating biker would just take a different route. They saw Cole as a loud, dangerous nuisance, a harsh reminder of the rougher, darker edges of the world they were desperately trying to ignore. But Martha did not hate the noise. To her, that loud, aggressive rumble was not a nuisance at all. It was a highly reliable, incredibly comforting clock. She would hear the deep sound of the engine starting up in the far distance, a low, thumping heartbeat cutting through the heavy morning heat. As the sound grew louder, vibrating closer and closer down the ruined street, we knew it was exactly time to move. She would step out onto her decaying porch, feeling the hot, dry air hit her face. By the time Cole's heavy black motorcycle swung around the final bend, bringing him into direct view of her fading yellow house, Martha was already making her slow, deliberate walk down the cracked concrete path. The first few times their paths crossed, it was entirely accidental. Cole was just riding to his hot, suffocating garage, his mind heavy with dark memories, his tired eyes scanning the empty road ahead. He saw the frail old woman walking to her rusted mailbox, of course. His sharp eyes noticed everything. He noticed her slow, painful limp. He noticed the faded floral print of her thin dress, and he noticed the quiet, fierce determination in her worn face. But he did not stop, and he did not stare. He simply registered her presence, filing her away in his mind as just another fragile, broken piece of the town. He fully expected her to flinch at the deafening sound of his exhaust, to scowl at him, or to quickly turn her head away in fear, just like everyone else did. But Martha never flinched. She did not scowl, and she certainly did not look away. The very first time she actually looked directly at him, it caught Cole completely off guard. He was rolling slowly past her rusted chain-link fence, the heavy engine idling loudly beneath him. She was standing perfectly still at the end of her driveway, one hand resting on the hot metal of the mailbox. She turned her head slowly, lifting her sharp, clear eyes, and she looked right into his. She did not look at his intimidating tattoos. She did not look at his greasy leather vest. And she did not judge the loud, aggressive machine he rode. She simply looked at the man. Her gaze was incredibly steady, calm, and completely devoid of fear. In that brief, fleeting second, as the motorcycle rolled past, Cole felt a strange, sudden jolt in his chest. It was the sudden, shocking realization that he was being truly seen. Days slowly turned into long, agonizing weeks, and the brutal Texas summer dragged on, baking the town into submission. And as the weeks passed, that brief, accidental eye contact evolved into something much deeper, something entirely deliberate. It became the single most consistent anchor in both of their chaotic, lonely lives. Cole found himself slightly adjusting his speed as he approached her block. He would ease off the heavy throttle, letting the motorcycle glide just a little bit slower, dragging out the few seconds it took to pass her driveway. He wanted to make absolutely sure she was there. He needed to see her standing at that mailbox. It became a quiet, personal mission, a tiny, fragile way to keep the promise he had made to his dead brother. He could not save Sam, but he could make damn sure that he watched over this fragile, solitary woman. Eventually, the stare turned into the nod. It was a very small, incredibly subtle gesture, but in the silent, hardened language of Blackwood, it spoke massive volumes. A wave would have been far too friendly, far too intrusive for two people who carried so many dark secrets. A wave demanded a conversation, a cheerful smile, a breaking of the protective walls they had both built. But a nod was different. A nod was a mark of deep mutual respect. It happened exactly at 8 o'clock every single morning. As Cole rode past the loud engine rumbling beneath him, he would slowly lift his left hand from the heavy clutch lever. He would not wave. He would simply raise two thick, grease-stained fingers into the hot air, keeping his dark eyes locked firmly on hers. It was a silent, powerful salute, and Martha, standing in the dry, blowing dust, would respond. She would not smile, but the hard, guarded lines around her mouth would soften just a fraction. She would dip her chin in a slow, deliberate nod, holding his gaze until the motorcycle rolled past and disappeared down the shimmering, heat-distorted road. For Cole, that daily nod was a brief, powerful moment of pure peace. It was a tiny sliver of light in his dark, guilt-ridden mind. When he saw her standing there, when he received that quiet acknowledgement, he felt a sudden heavy relief wash over him. It meant that the world had not completely fallen apart overnight. It meant that one small, fragile thing was exactly where it was supposed to be. He would ride into his suffocating garage with a slightly lighter heart, ready to fight the broken engines and the terrible heat, knowing that the old woman was safe for another day. He did not know her name. He did not know her painful history, but he knew he was fiercely, silently protecting her. For Martha, the heavy tattooed biker, was something entirely different. He was not just a friendly face. He was her absolute lifeline. She was an incredibly smart, highly calculated woman, surviving on the edge of a very dangerous knife. She knew exactly what she was doing every morning. She was building a solid, unbreakable pattern. And in Cole, she had finally found the perfect witness. She watched his sharp eyes. She noted the cautious, protective way he slowed his heavy bike down, and she recognized the deep, familiar vigilance in his face. She knew with absolute comforting certainty that this rough, solitary man was actually paying close attention. He was the only person in this entire blind town who actually saw her. She did not care about his dark past, and she did not care about the loud noise of his machine. She only cared that he was reliable. She knew that the ruthless people hunting her son's secrets were closing in, tightening the invisible noose around her fading yellow house. She could feel the heavy danger in the air, pressing down on her like the Texas heat. But every morning when Cole raised those two fingers, Martha felt a surge of quiet, defiant strength. It was a silent agreement between two survivors. He was telling her, "I see you," and she was telling him, "I am still here." They never spoke a single word to one another. They never shared a cup of coffee. They never complained about the terrible weather, and they never learned each other's names. But in the vast, empty loneliness of the desert, words were often cheap and entirely useless anyway. Their silent daily ritual was stronger than any conversation could ever be. It was a heavy ironclad bond, a quiet pact made in the blowing dust. They were two isolated soldiers holding the line in a town that had long ago surrendered to the dark. And because that quiet bond was so incredibly strong, because it was built on such deep, deliberate observation, the break in the pattern was going to be absolutely devastating. The deafening silence of a missing routine would be louder than a bomb going off. The clock was quietly, steadily ticking down to zero, and the fragile peace they had built together was about to be violently, permanently shattered. When the heavy, warped wooden front door finally closed, shutting out the glaring Texas sun, the fading yellow house instantly transformed. It stopped being a home, and it became a silent, waiting fortress. Martha Vance would push her thin, frail weight against the solid wood, carefully sliding the heavy brass deadbolt into place. She always waited to hear the loud metallic click. That sharp sound echoing in the empty hallway was the only confirmation she had that she was safe at least for a few more hours. The air inside the small house was incredibly stale, thick with the smell of old dust, dried lavender, and the faint metallic scent of lingering fear. She would slowly walk into her dim, cluttered living room, the worn floorboards groaning softly under her feet. She never turned on the television, and she never played the radio. She preferred the absolute silence. In the heavy silence, she could hear the house settling. She could hear the wind brushing against the glass, and most importantly, she could hear if anyone was trying to get inside. Martha would ease herself into a worn, faded armchair, sitting in the corner of the room. It was her favorite spot, strategically placed, so she could clearly see both the front door and the back window at the exact same time. She would sit there, her breathing slow and shallow, her arthritic hands resting quietly in her lap, and she would look up at the dusty stone mantelpiece above the cold, empty fireplace. Sitting directly in the center of the mantel inside a cheap, tarnished silver frame was a photograph. It was a picture of a young man in his early 20s, smiling brightly at the camera. He had a handsome, confident face, dark hair pushed carelessly out of his eyes, and a wide, charming smile that could easily talk his way out of any trouble. This was Tommy. He was her only child, her absolute pride, and the source of her current terrifying nightmare. To understand Martha's desperate daily routine, you have to truly understand the tragic story of Tommy Vance. He was not born a bad person. In fact, he was a deeply sensitive, incredibly bright boy. Growing up in a dying town like Blackwood, with a mother who worked 3 grueling jobs just to keep the lights on, Tommy had learned the harsh realities of poverty very early. He hated seeing his mother struggle. He hated the worn-out shoes, the empty refrigerator, and the constant suffocating anxiety about money. He made a fierce, childish promise that he would eventually save her, that he would pull them both out of the desert dirt and buy them a beautiful life, somewhere green and safe. But good intentions in a desperate, hungry world are often the very things that lead young men straight into the dark. Tommy wanted to get rich, and he wanted to get rich very fast. He did not want to wait decades grinding away in a hot garage or a dusty factory. So he started making dangerous compromises. He started running small errands across the southern border, delivering unmarked packages for men who never gave their real names. The money was incredibly good fast and entirely untraceable. At first, Tommy thought he was outsmarting the system. He started driving expensive, flashy cars, wearing expensive clothes, and handing his mother thick, heavy envelopes full of $100 bills. Martha had tried to refuse the money, her maternal instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. But Tommy had laughed it off, flashing that charming smile, telling her it was just a smart business investment. He told her not to worry, that he had everything completely under control. But nobody ever really controls a cartel. It is a massive, starving beast, and it eventually consumes everyone who tries to feed it. The easy, flashy errands quickly turned into massive, high-stakes operations. Tommy was promoted moving large amounts of illegal cash, managing hidden offshore accounts, and keeping meticulous records of massive, bloody transactions. He became a crucial, trusted accountant for some of the most ruthless, violent men operating in the Deep South. And with that dark promotion, the charming smile finally vanished from his face. The confident boy was quickly replaced by a pale, terrified man. He started losing weight, his eyes grew dark and haunted, and he constantly looked over his shoulder, jumping at every loud noise. He realized far too late that he was trapped in a room with no exits. The terrible climax happened exactly 6 years ago. It was late at night, the air thick with a coming desert storm. Martha had been sitting in her armchair, unable to sleep, when the front door burst open. Tommy stumbled inside, completely drenched in cold sweat, gasping for air. He looked like a hunted animal. He was shaking violently, his eyes wide with absolute primal panic. He fell to his knees in front of her, pressing a small, heavy object into her trembling hands. It was a cold brass key attached to a thick metal tag. He told her, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper, that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He had skimmed money, millions of dollars, and he had hidden the financial ledger, the only map to the stolen cash, inside a safety deposit box in a distant city. That brass key was the only way to open it. He begged his mother to hide the key, to never speak of it, and to never ever try to use it. He told her that he was going to run, that he was going to draw their attention far away from Blackwood, so she could be safe. He kissed her forehead, his tears mixing with the sweat on his face, and he ran out into the dark night. That was the very last time Martha ever saw her son alive. 3 days later, a local state trooper knocked on her heavy door. He politely took off his hat, and he delivered the crushing expected news. There had been a terrible car crash on a lonely highway near the border. The vehicle was completely burned, destroyed beyond recognition. They said it was a tragic accident, but Martha knew the absolute truth. The cartel does not allow accidents. It was an execution. It was a brutal, fiery message. For the first few years after his violent death, Martha lived in a state of frozen, constant terror. She hid the heavy brass key inside a hollowed-out space beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. She expected the ruthless men in dark suits to kick her door down every single night. She barely slept. She barely ate, simply waiting for the inevitable end. But the men did not come. The cartel was vast, distracted by its own internal wars, and they assumed the hidden ledger had burned in the twisted wreckage with Tommy. They forgot about the quiet, grieving widow living at the edge of a forgotten desert town. They left her alone in her silent yellow house. But secrets especially, secrets worth millions of dollars, never stay buried forever. Eventually, rumors begin to circulate. A loose end is discovered, an old file is opened, and the starving beast remembers it is missing a meal. Over the last few months, the atmosphere around the fading yellow house had subtly, dangerously changed. Martha was old, but her mind was incredibly sharp. She noticed the small, chilling details. She noticed the click on the telephone line when she picked up the receiver. She noticed a dark, unmarked car parked 3 blocks away, sitting in the heavy heat for hours without moving. She found a strange, heavy footprint in the soft dirt near her back window, a boot print far too large to belong to any of her elderly neighbors. They were finally circling back. They were methodically retracing Tommy's final desperate steps, and all those steps led directly to her front door. She had faced a terrible, terrifying choice. She could run packing a small bag and fleeing into the vast, empty country. But she was 74 years old. Her joints ached. She had no real money, and she knew she could not outrun professional hunters. She could go to the local police, but she knew the brutal reality of border towns. Half the department was deeply corrupt, firmly on the cartel payroll, and the other half was completely incompetent. Going to the authorities was essentially signing her own death warrant. So Martha made a different choice. She chose not to run, and she chose not to hide. She decided to stand her ground right in the middle of the fading yellow house. She accepted that they were going to come for her. It was a mathematical certainty. But she stubbornly refused to simply vanish into the dark like a frightened victim. If she was going to be taken, she was going to make sure it created a massive, glaring hole in the fabric of the town. That is why she created the unyielding morning routine. That is why she walked to the rusted mailbox at exactly 8 o'clock every single day, planting herself firmly in the direct line of sight of the rough, solitary biker. Cole Bennett was not just a familiar face. He was her carefully chosen insurance policy. She knew he was deeply observant, she knew he carried a heavy protective guilt, and she knew he would notice if her pattern suddenly broke. She was using her own fragile life as bait, setting a silent, desperate trap. She sat in her worn armchair, the Texas heat pressing against the windows, her eyes locked on the front door. She was terrified, yes, but she was also incredibly ready. The long wait was almost over. Thursday morning broke over Blackwood like a heavy, suffocating curse. The Texas sun did not gently rise. It violently attacked the horizon, casting an angry, bright red glare over the cracked desert dirt. By 7 in the morning, the heavy air was already entirely unbreathable. It was thick, stagnant, and it tasted like dry dust and old rust. There was absolutely no breeze, not even a whisper of wind to push the heavy heat away. The stray dogs had already retreated completely under the rotting porches, panting heavily in the dark, and the few tough residents of Elm Street were hiding behind their closed blinds, praying for the brutal day to just end. It was the kind of harsh, oppressive weather that makes people irritable, tired, and entirely blind to the world around them. It was the perfect morning for a terrible thing to happen quietly. Cole Bennett felt the intense heat pressing heavily against his broad shoulders as he kicked the heavy starter of his black chopper. The massive engine roared to life violently, shaking the dry ground beneath his heavy leather boots. He did not wear a helmet, just dark sunglasses to block the harsh, blinding glare of the morning sun. The loud, deafening rumble of his motorcycle echoed loudly through the empty trailer park, a harsh, aggressive sound that perfectly matched his dark, heavy mood. He pulled out onto the ruined asphalt, twisting the heavy throttle, letting the hot, dry air rush past his bearded face. The ride to his dark cinder block garage was the exact same every single day. He knew every deep pothole. He knew every rusted stop sign. And he knew exactly when to start slowing down. As he turned his heavy bike onto Elm Street, Cole felt his tense muscles instinctively relax, just a tiny fraction. He was nearing the fading yellow house. He was nearing the one small, reliable moment of his entire chaotic day. His rough, calloused left hand reached out, resting lightly on the heavy metal clutch lever, preparing for the familiar, silent ritual. His dark eyes scanned the bright, shimmering road ahead, looking for the small, fragile figure standing by the rusted metal mailbox. He listened to the steady thumping rhythm of his engine, waiting for the exact moment to raise his 2 fingers into the hot air. He rolled past the first few abandoned houses, the engine idling low and heavy. He passed the dead yellow lawns. He passed the broken, shattered sidewalks. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto the specific spot at the very end of the cracked concrete path. But his hand never left the metal clutch lever. The 2-finger salute was never given. The porch was completely empty. Cole immediately squeezed the heavy brakes, the thick rubber tires dragging harshly against the hot asphalt. The large motorcycle shuddered, dropping to a slow, crawling pace before coming to a complete heavy stop directly in front of her house. The loud engine continued to rumble aggressively between his legs, but to Cole, the entire world had suddenly violently gone completely silent. He planted his heavy boots firmly on the hot road, his chest freezing despite the suffocating Texas heat. A sudden sharp spike of pure freezing dread pierced right through his stomach. It was a physical, painful shock, like stepping onto a missing stair in the absolute dark. He pushed his dark sunglasses up, resting them on his forehead, his tired eyes narrowing as he stared hard at the fading yellow house. The old wooden porch, usually occupied by the determined, fragile old woman, was completely bare. The cracked concrete path was empty. The rusted metal mailbox, the silent anchor of their daily connection, stood lonely and unuttered at the end of the dirt driveway. It was exactly 8 o'clock. Cole looked down at the heavy silver watch strapped to his thick wrist just to be absolutely certain. It was 1 minute past 8 o'clock. She was never late. Not a single time in all these long, exhausting weeks. She had never missed a single morning, no matter how terribly hot it was, no matter how badly her old bones must have ached. Cole sat frozen on his heavy machine, the intense heat baking his leather vest. But he felt incredibly, terribly cold. He started to look for the small, logical details, desperately trying to build a safe, boring explanation. He looked at the heavy wooden front door. It was closed tight. He looked at the front windows. The faded yellow curtains were drawn completely shut, blocking out the morning sun, revealing absolutely nothing about the dark interior. There were no strange cars parked on the street. There were no obvious loud signs of a violent struggle on the dry lawn. To anyone else, to any normal passing driver, it just looked like a quiet, sleepy house on a very hot morning. But Cole was not a normal passing driver. He was a man who lived intimately with ghosts, a man who intimately understood the subtle, quiet shape of tragedy. He tried to force his racing mind to slow down. He told himself with a desperate, heavy logic that she was just an old woman. Old people get sick. Old people have bad days. Maybe she had a terrible headache. Maybe the brutal summer heat had finally forced her to stay inside her cool, dark living room. Maybe she had simply overslept her tired body demanding rest. He aggressively tried to talk himself out of the sudden rising panic. He told himself to just put the bike in gear to drive away and to mind his own broken business. But the freezing dread refused to leave his chest. It sat there, heavy and sharp, like a jagged stone. Because Cole recognized this specific terrible feeling. It was the exact same feeling he had violently ignored all those years ago. It was the exact same cold, twisting knot in his stomach he felt when his younger brother Sam had stopped answering the telephone. Back then, Cole had used the exact same lazy logic. He had told himself that Sam was just busy, that Sam was just sleeping off a wild night, that everything was perfectly fine. He had chosen the comfortable lie over the terrifying truth, and that cowardly choice had cost his brother everything. Sitting there in the blazing Texas sun, staring at the empty wooden porch, the heavy ghost of Sam stood right beside him. The memory of his brother's dark, haunted eyes flashed violently in his mind. The crushing heavy guilt, the guilt he carried every single day of his miserable life, flared up, burning hotter than the sun above him. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that he was standing at the exact same crossroads again. The steady pattern had violently broken. The quiet, fragile alarm had been tripped. The world was offering him a comfortable, easy excuse to look away, just like it did before. Cole's jaw clenched tight, his teeth grinding together under his thick beard. He stared at the rusted metal mailbox for a long, agonizing minute. He listened to the heavy, rhythmic thumping of his engine, the only sound in the dead, silent street. He could not kick the door down right now. He had no legal right, no absolute proof, and it had only been 5 minutes. If he broke into an old woman's house because she was 5 minutes late, the corrupt local police would lock him up immediately, and he would be entirely useless to her. He had to be smart. He had to be patient, even though every single nerve in his large body was screaming at him to act. With a heavy, reluctant sigh, Cole finally pulled his dark sunglasses back down over his eyes. He slowly squeezed the heavy clutch lever, kicked the heavy gear shifter down, and twisted the throttle. The massive motorcycle roared loudly, pulling away from the curb, leaving the fading yellow house behind in the blowing dust. He rode toward his hot, suffocating garage, forcing himself to follow his own daily routine. But as he rode down the shimmering, ruined asphalt, his mind remained entirely fixed on that empty wooden porch. He was physically leaving, but his protective instinct was now fully awake, and it was absolutely terrified. He made a silent, heavy promise to the empty desert air. He would give her one day. He would give her the benefit of the doubt for exactly 24 hours. But if that old porch was empty tomorrow morning, all the polite rules were going right out the window. Friday morning finally arrived, and the brutal Texas heat somehow felt even more oppressive than the day before. The heavy, stagnant air felt completely, entirely unbreathable. Cole Bennett stood inside his dark, cinder-block garage, completely surrounded by broken, rusted machines. Usually, this dirty, hot room was his absolute sanctuary. The heavy smell of old motor oil, the harsh scent of gasoline, and the loud metallic clanging of heavy steel tools were his daily meditation. When he worked on a completely shattered engine, he could easily shut off his racing mind. He could simply focus on the greasy bolts, the heavy pistons, and the logical, predictable mechanics of fixing something broken. But today, the heavy tools felt completely useless in his large, calloused hands. His mental sanctuary was completely broken, violently invaded by the lingering, terrifying image of an empty wooden porch. Cole was leaning heavily over the open hood of an old, battered Ford pickup truck. He was trying to rebuild a completely dead V8 engine. His hands, thick and covered in dark black grease, were holding a heavy steel wrench. But his hands were slightly shaking. He tried to tighten a rusted bolt, pulling hard on the heavy wrench, but his mind was completely disconnected from his physical body. Every single time he blinked, he saw that rusted metal mailbox. He saw the faded yellow paint curling off the dry wood of her house. He kept looking up, staring blankly out of the massive open bay doors of his garage. He stared out into the shimmering hot street, half expecting to see the frail old woman walking slowly past his shop. But the dusty street was entirely empty. The deafening silence of that missing routine echoed loudly in his head. It was a heavy rhythmic pulse beating against his skull like a dark drum. And that heavy beat acted like a brutal key, violently unlocking the darkest, most painful room in his memory. As he stared blindly at the broken engine, the loud country music playing on his old radio seemed to slowly fade away. The intense heat of the garage faded away. He was suddenly pulled violently back into the terrible past. He remembered the exact night he found out about his younger brother Sam. It was a memory that he usually fought incredibly hard to suppress, a memory that constantly threatened to drown him. But today, the heavy guilt came flooding back with absolute terrifying clarity. He vividly remembered sitting alone in his dark, narrow trailer. It had been raining that night, a cold, bitter rain that felt completely wrong for the dry Texas climate. He was sitting in the dark, drinking a cheap, warm beer, aggressively ignoring the chaotic world outside his thin walls. Then came the knock. It was a loud, aggressive official knock on his rusted metal door. Cole remembered opening the door, feeling a sudden cold rush of damp air. Two tired, soaked county sheriffs were standing quietly on his small porch. They did not even have to speak a single word. Cole saw the heavy, tragic look in their exhausted eyes, and his entire world instantly collapsed into ash. They told him in low, professional voices that Sam had been found. He was found behind an abandoned, rotting warehouse far outside the city limits. They told Cole it was a violent scene. It was a completely senseless, brutal end to a young, confused life. But the absolute worst part, the crushing, heavy detail that completely broke Cole's soul, came later. When they handed Cole his brother's cheap plastic phone, Cole saw the screen. Sam had frantically tried to call him. He had called Cole 3 times that very night right before he was killed. 3 desperate, panicked calls for help, completely ignored. Cole had let the phone ring into the dark simply because he was too tired, too selfish, and too angry to deal with his younger brother's problems. He had chosen to look the exact other way, and that lazy choice had cost Sam his life. That massive, catastrophic failure completely ruined Cole. It destroyed the man he used to be. It forced him into this lonely, isolated life in Blackwood. He promised the bloody ghost of his brother that he would never ever be that deaf, blind man again. He swore he would never let a ringing phone go unanswered, and he would never ignore a clear, desperate cry for help. And right now, standing in the suffocating heat of his garage, that empty, rusted mailbox was screaming at him. It was a silent, terrifying scream, but to Cole, it was the loudest alarm he had ever heard. The old woman. The fragile stranger he only knew through a silent nod was desperately calling out to him, and he had driven right past her. The rest of Friday dragged on with an agonizing, brutal slowness. The blazing Texas sun finally began to sink, casting long, bloody, dark shadows across the oil-stained concrete floor of the garage. Cole aggressively wiped his dirty hands on a heavily stained red rag. He locked up the massive bay doors, pulling the heavy rusted metal chains incredibly tight. He swung his leg over his heavy black chopper, and he rode slowly back to his small, hot trailer park. He tried to eat a cold, tasteless sandwich, but his stomach was tied into a painful, tight knot. The dry bread tasted like sand. He tossed the food into the trash, his frustration boiling over. He lay awake on his narrow, uncomfortable bed for the entire night. The small, dirty air conditioning unit rattled loudly in the thin window, blowing warm, dusty air across his tattooed chest. But it did not cool his violently racing mind. He stared hard at the dark, water-stained ceiling, his eyes wide open. He kept thinking about the frail old woman. Who was she really? Did she have any loving family looking for her? Was she simply lying helpless on her hard kitchen floor, suddenly sick and entirely unable to reach a telephone? Or was it something far, far worse? As he lay in the dark, a cold, chilling memory suddenly surfaced. A few nights ago, he had been riding home late from the garage. He remembered seeing a dark, unmarked black Chevy Suburban idling quietly near her dusty street. It had dark-tinted windows, and it was sitting entirely still in the heavy heat, completely out of place in this dying town. He had casually dismissed it at the time, assuming it was just lost tourists or a confused delivery driver. But now that dark, silent vehicle felt like a massive, terrifying threat. It felt completely calculated. People like that old woman did not just randomly vanish. They were taken. The long, agonizing night finally began to fade. The dark, starry sky slowly turned a pale, dusty gray color. It was Saturday morning. It was day 3. Cole slowly sat up on the very edge of his narrow bed. The heavy exhaustion was completely gone. He did not feel tired. He did not feel confused. And he did not feel helpless anymore. He felt a cold, incredibly sharp focus settling deeply into his heavy bones. It was a dangerous primal instinct waking up. He stood up, his large frame filling the cramped room. He pulled on his heavy denim jeans. He slid his thick, muscular arms into his worn leather vest, and he tightly laced up his heavy, scuffed work boots. He walked over to his small, rusted metal closet. He reached his large hand up to the very top shelf, pushing past old, dusty boxes. His fingers wrapped around cold, heavy steel. He pulled down his old, incredibly reliable revolver. It was a heavy, intimidating weapon wrapped in an old, oily rag. He carefully opened the heavy cylinder, checking the cold brass bullets, making absolutely sure it was fully loaded. He snapped the cylinder shut with a loud, sharp click. He tucked the heavy weapon securely into his thick leather belt, pulling his dark shirt down to cover it. He was not going to call the corrupt, lazy police. He knew they would do absolutely nothing. Cole walked out into the early morning heat. The dying town was completely silent, still heavily asleep. He swung his heavy leg over his massive black motorcycle, and he turned the heavy ignition key. He made a firm, unbreakable, silent promise to the empty desert air. He was going to ride straight down Elm Street. He was going to look directly at that fading yellow house. And if that old wooden porch was entirely empty for the 3rd day in a row, he was not going to drive away. The polite patient waiting was completely over. Day 3 was the absolute low limit. He kicked the heavy starter. The loud engine roared to life, and Cole rode off into the blinding rising sun, entirely ready to burn his own world down, to find her. Saturday morning arrived with a heavy, dead silence. The Texas sun was already burning fiercely, turning the pale, dusty sky into a blinding, bright white canvas. As Cole Bennett rode his heavy chopper down the cracked pavement of Elm Street, the loud, aggressive roar of his engine felt incredibly invasive. It was the only sound in a town that felt completely abandoned. He did not ride slowly this time. He did not ease off the throttle, and he did not gently prepare his hand for a silent salute. His dark eyes were locked in a cold, hard stare, focused entirely on the end of the long, ruined street. He braced himself for the harsh reality he knew was waiting for him. As he rounded the final familiar bend, the fading yellow house finally came into view. Cole felt a heavy, cold weight drop to the very bottom of his stomach. The old wooden porch was completely empty. There was no fragile woman standing in the morning heat. The rusted metal mailbox stood entirely alone at the edge of the dirt driveway. This was day 3. The pattern was definitively permanently broken. Cole did not hesitate for a single second. He did not try to rationalize the terrible absence anymore, and he did not look for any comfortable excuses. He aggressively squeezed the heavy handbrake, bringing the massive black motorcycle to a sudden loud stop right at the curb. He kicked the heavy metal stand down with the heel of his thick boot. He reached over and he violently twisted the silver ignition key, completely killing the roaring engine. The sudden deafening silence of the empty street rushed in, pressing down heavily against his ringing ears. It was a terrifying, unnatural quiet. He slowly swung his large leg over the hot leather seat, planting his heavy boots firmly on the dry, baking asphalt. He stood entirely still for a long moment, his broad shoulders tense, his hand resting instinctively near the heavy steel revolver tucked into his belt. He began to meticulously scan the fading yellow house, looking at it not as a neighbor, but as a dangerous crime scene. His sharp, tired eyes picked apart the small, subtle details that the rest of the ignorant world would easily miss. First, he looked at the front windows. The faded yellow curtains were drawn completely shut, just like yesterday. But today, he noticed they were pulled incredibly tight, stretched almost to their breaking point, overlapping slightly in the middle. Martha was a creature of precise, meticulous habit. She would have arranged them perfectly, leaving a tiny, neat gap for the sunlight. This was sloppy. This was done in a sudden, careless rush. Then his eyes drifted down to the edge of the driveway, locking onto the rusted metal mailbox. The small metal door was not fully closed. It was left slightly open, hanging open just a fraction of an inch, casting a small, dark shadow. Martha would never, ever leave it like that. She was a woman who completely relied on strict, perfect order to survive. That slightly open door was a glaring, terrifying alarm bell. Cole took a slow, deep breath of the hot, dusty air, steeling his nerves. He stepped off the cracked asphalt, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the loose, dry gravel of her front path. He walked slowly, his body completely tense, ready for any sudden movement or sound. The dry heat radiated off the dead yellow weeds in her front yard. But Cole felt entirely cold. He climbed the 3 short, rotting wooden steps up to her front porch. The old wooden floorboards groaned heavily under his massive weight, a loud protesting creak that echoed in the quiet morning. He stood directly in front of the heavy wooden door. He raised his large, calloused fist, and he knocked. It was a firm, solid knock, the sound thudding dully against the thick wood. He waited, holding his breath, listening desperately for the soft shuffle of her worn leather shoes or the quiet sound of her fragile voice. He heard absolutely nothing, just the dry Texas wind brushing against the side of the house. He knocked again, much louder this time, the heavy blows shaking the entire doorframe. "Ma'am," Cole called out, his deep, rough voice cutting sharply through the heavy silence. "It is Cole, from the motorcycle. Are you in there?" The silence that answered him was heavy, thick, and entirely deeply wrong. It was the kind of total silence that only exists when a space has been completely emptied of life. Cole lowered his fist, his jaw clenching tight under his dark beard. He reached out his thick fingers, wrapping carefully around the old tarnished brass doorknob. He expected it to be firmly locked. He fully expected to have to kick the heavy door open, splintering the old wood. But as he gently turned his wrist, the brass knob clicked softly, and the heavy door gave way. It was completely unlatched. Cole gently pushed the door inward. The rusted hinges let out a long, painful squeal, protesting the slow movement. The door swung open, revealing the dark, stifling interior of the fading yellow house. The stale air that rushed out hit him like a physical blow. It smelled like old dust-dry lavender and a faint, terrifying trace of harsh men's cologne. It was the sharp, bitter smell of dangerous strangers. Cole stepped carefully over the threshold, his right hand gripping the cold handle of his heavy revolver. He let his eyes slowly adjust to the dim, dusty light filtering in through the edges of the tight curtains. The hallway was completely silent. He moved forward, his heavy boots stepping softly, intentionally avoiding the creaking floorboards. He walked slowly into the small, cluttered living room, his sharp eyes sweeping every dark corner, every shadow searching for an immediate threat. The room was empty, but it told a loud, incredibly violent story. It did not look like a random, chaotic robbery. The old tube television was still sitting quietly in the corner. Her cheap silver-plated silverware was likely still in the kitchen drawers. A random junkie looking for quick cash would have torn the entire place apart, emptying every cabinet and destroying the furniture. But this room was different. This destruction was highly targeted, incredibly fast, and brutally efficient. It was the clear, undeniable work of professional men. Near the center of the worn, faded rug, a small wooden side table lay completely violently overturned. A delicate ceramic teacup had been smashed against the hard floorboards, the dried brown stain of old tea soaking deeply into the old wood. Next to the broken table, A single worn leather slipper lay completely abandoned, sitting entirely alone in the dust. Cole stared at the small, fragile shoe, his heart pounding heavily in his chest. A woman does not just leave one shoe behind unless she is being violently, forcefully dragged out of her own home. He stepped further into the dim room, his dark eyes drawn to the dusty stone mantelpiece above the cold, empty fireplace. He saw a wide, empty space in the thick layer of dust. He looked down at the wooden floor below the mantel. Lying there, completely shattered, was a cheap, tarnished silver picture frame. The glass was broken into a dozen sharp, jagged pieces, sparkling faintly in the dim light. Cole knelt down slowly, the joints in his heavy knees popping loudly in the quiet room. He used his thick, rough fingers to carefully brush the sharp shards of broken glass away. He picked up the photograph that had been inside the silver frame. It was a picture of a young, handsome man, smiling brightly at the camera. The young man had dark hair and a wide, confident smile. But right across the young man's face, a heavy, dirty boot print had been violently stamped into the glossy paper. It was a massive, aggressive footprint, far too large to belong to anyone who lived in this dying neighborhood. It was a deliberate, cruel message left behind by the men who had broken down this door. Cole stood up slowly, clutching the ruined photograph tightly in his massive hand. The crushing, heavy dread in his stomach instantly vanished completely, replaced by a rising, terrifying wave of pure, absolute rage. The dark, unmarked black Suburban he had seen idling on the street a few nights ago suddenly flashed brightly in his mind. It was no longer a vague, passing suspicion. It was a concrete, undeniable threat. They had finally come for her. The ruthless, violent ghosts of her past had finally kicked down her heavy door, snatching her away into the dark, suffocating Texas night. He looked around the quiet, empty room one last time. He saw the overturned table, the shattered glass, and the single abandoned slipper. He knew exactly what he had to do. He was not going to call the corrupt, lazy police. He was not going to file a pointless missing person report and wait for days while the old woman was terrified, or worse. The heavy, protective promise he had made to his dead brother was burning fiercely in his chest. He shoved the heavy steel revolver deeper into his leather belt. He walked out of the fading yellow house, leaving the front door wide open. He marched down the cracked concrete path, his eyes burning with a dark, violent determination. He was going to find those men. And he was going to make them deeply, terribly sorry that they ever stepped foot in his dying town. Cole walked back to his heavy chopper, the dry gravel crunching loudly under his boots. He did not look back at the open door of the fading yellow house. He could not afford to look back. He had to keep his mind completely focused, locked entirely on the violent task ahead. He swung his large leg over the hot leather seat, and he forcefully kicked the heavy starter. The massive engine roared to life, a loud, aggressive scream that tore through the quiet morning. He twisted the heavy throttle, leaving Elm Street behind, in a thick cloud of swirling hot dust. As he rode aggressively through the waking town, Cole felt a strange, cold clarity wash over his tired mind. For the last several years, he had lived like a quiet, passive ghost. He had kept his head completely down. He had minded his own broken business, and he had let the chaotic world pass him by. But that quiet, passive man was entirely gone. Oh. The heavy, crushing guilt that usually paralyzed his chest had suddenly transformed into a dark, burning fuel. He was no longer the broken mechanic who hid in a dark garage. He was shifting back into a much older, much more dangerous version of himself. He was the man who used to ride with rough, violent men, the man who knew exactly how the dark, hidden underbelly of the Texas border truly operated. He knew that calling the local police was a complete tragic waste of precious time. If he went to the dusty sheriff's station, Martha would simply become a thin white piece of paper on a messy, crowded desk. They would ask 100 pointless questions, they would fill out endless bureaucratic forms, and they would ultimately do absolutely nothing. They would drag their feet, blaming the intense summer heat or the lack of solid evidence. Cole knew this painful truth intimately. He remembered exactly how long it took them to find his younger brother Sam. He remembered the empty, hollow promises they made while his brother was already lying dead in the dirt. He was absolutely not going to let Martha become another forgotten tragic file. If you want to find a dark, unmarked vehicle in a dying, isolated town like Blackwood, you do not ask the police. You ask the unseen people, the quiet, tired workers, who actually watch the empty roads when everyone else is heavily asleep. Cole knew exactly where he needed to go. He rode his heavy motorcycle past the crumbling downtown, past the empty, rusted train tracks, and headed straight toward the very edge of the county line. He was going to a place that never closed, a lonely outpost that caught every single person entering or leaving the vast desert. 30 minutes later, Cole pulled his roaring chopper into the cracked, oil-stained parking lot of a lonely, sun-bleached gas station. It was a miserable, run-down building sitting completely alone on a long stretch of empty highway. The old metal overhang provided a small patch of dark shade, but the intense heat still radiated powerfully off the dirty concrete. Cole killed the loud engine, the sudden silence rushing back into his ringing ears. He stepped off the bike, adjusting the heavy steel revolver hidden under his leather vest. He walked toward the glass door, the small cheap bell dinging sharply as he pushed his way inside. The air inside the small station was incredibly cold, blasting from a loud, rattling air conditioning unit mounted in the ceiling. The store smelled heavily of old burnt coffee, cheap stale tobacco, and harsh chemical floor cleaner. Standing behind the scratched, bulletproof glass of the main counter was a thin, exhausted older man named Harlan. Harlan had worked the lonely graveyard shift at this gas station for over 20 years. He was a man made entirely of sharp angles, gray skin, and deep paranoid suspicion. He survived by noticing absolutely everything and saying absolutely nothing. Harlan looked up from a messy stack of dirty lottery tickets. His tired, bloodshot eyes widened slightly as Cole's massive frame filled the narrow aisle. Harlan knew exactly who Cole was. Everyone in the quiet, rough circles of Blackwood knew the solitary, heavily tattooed mechanic. They knew to leave him completely alone. "Morning, Cole," Harlan said, his voice a dry, raspy croak. He nervously wiped his thin, trembling hands on his stained work apron. "Bit early for you to be riding this far out, isn't it?" Cole did not offer a polite smile. He walked slowly up to the thick, scratched glass, planting his large, heavy hands firmly on the metal counter. He leaned forward, his broad shoulders blocking out the harsh fluorescent light above. He stared directly into Harlan's nervous eyes, holding the older man's gaze with an intense, unyielding pressure. "I need some quick information, Harlan," Cole said. His deep voice low, hard, and completely devoid of any friendly warmth. "And I need it right now. No games, no delays." Harlan swallowed hard, his thin Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his wrinkled throat. He took a small, cautious step back from the thick glass. "I just sell cheap gas, Cole. I don't know nothing about nothing. You know how it is out here. I just keep my eyes on the register." "Do not lie to me, Harlan," Cole interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, sounding like rocks grinding together. "I am not asking about local gossip. I am looking for a specific vehicle. A large black Chevy Suburban. No license plates, dark-tinted windows. It was rolling through the neighborhood a few nights ago. It did not belong here." Harlan's gray face suddenly went completely pale. His tired eyes darted nervously toward the empty, sun-baked highway outside, as if expecting the dark vehicle to suddenly reappear from the heat waves. He violently shook his head, his thin hands gripping the edge of the counter tight. "Cole, listen to me," Harlan whispered, his voice trembling with genuine, deep fear. "You do not want to go asking around about cars like that. Those are the kinds of men who do not leave loose ends. If I talk to you, and they ever find out I am a completely dead man, they will burn this entire place down with me, locked inside it." Cole understood the heavy fear. The cartel was a massive, terrifying shadow that hung constantly over these border towns. But Cole's fear for the fragile old woman was much, much stronger than any cartel. He leaned even closer to the scratched glass, his dark, intense eyes burning with a violent desperation. "Harlan, look at me," Cole said, his voice surprisingly quiet, but filled with a heavy, dangerous weight. "They took an old woman, a frail 74-year-old woman who lives completely alone. She has absolutely nothing to do with their violent world, but they kicked her heavy door down and they dragged her into the dark. I am the only person coming for her. If you do not tell me exactly what you saw, her blood is going to be on your hands right next to theirs." Harlan stopped shaking. The heavy, tragic truth of Cole's words seemed to pierce right through his thick wall of pure self-preservation. He looked at Cole's tortured face, seeing the raw, agonizing guilt shining in the mechanic's dark eyes. Harlan let out a long, heavy, defeated sigh, his thin shoulders slumping in deep surrender. "Thursday night," Harlan whispered, his voice barely audible over the loud rattling of the air conditioner. "It was very late, maybe around 3 in the morning. The dark Suburban pulled up to pump number 4. 3 men got out. They were wearing dark, expensive clothes. They moved incredibly fast, like trained professional soldiers. They had cold, dead eyes, Cole. The kind of eyes that have seen way too much blood." Cole leaned in his entire body, rigid with absolute focus. "Did you see her? Was the old woman inside the truck?" "I could not see through the dark glass," Harlan replied, shaking his head slowly. "But they bought a lot of cheap bottled water and a few heavy metal flashlights. And then the tall one, the one with the heavy scar on his neck, asked me a direct question." "What did he ask Harlan?" Cole demanded, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. "He asked for the fastest, most direct dirt road leading out to the old Anaconda copper mines," Harlan said, his voice trembling again. He wanted to know if the main access gates were still rusted shut, or if a heavy truck could easily smash right through them. Cole felt a sudden cold chill run all the way down his heavy spine. The Anaconda copper mines. It was a massive abandoned industrial site located over 30 miles deep into the unforgiving empty desert. It was a huge, deep scar in the dry earth, surrounded by steep, treacherous canyons and miles of completely dead rocky land. It had been shut down decades ago, left to slowly rust and crumble under the brutal Texas sun. There was absolutely no cell phone service, no passing traffic, and no easy way out. It was the absolute perfect, terrifying place to hide a violent crime. It was the perfect place to make someone disappear forever. Cole slowly pushed himself away from the thick, scratched glass. He nodded once, a brief, silent gesture of deep gratitude. "Thank you, Harlan. You did not see me today. I was never here." Harlan just nodded quickly, backing away into the dark shadows of the small store. "You be incredibly careful, Cole. You are riding straight into a dark, heavy grave out there. Those men are not going to hesitate." "Neither am I," Cole said softly. He turned around, pushing the heavy glass door open, stepping back out into the suffocating, blinding heat. The Texas sun was climbing higher, turning the vast desert into a giant baking oven. The clock was ticking incredibly fast. Every single second that passed, the old woman was suffering in the dark. Cole walked quickly to his heavy black motorcycle. He checked the thick leather straps holding his saddlebags tight. He reached down to his thick belt, his rough thumb tracing the cold, heavy hammer of his steel revolver one last time. He knew he was riding completely alone into a highly dangerous, potentially fatal trap. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, and heading into unfamiliar hostile territory. But as he kicked the heavy starter, and the massive engine roared violently to life beneath him, Cole felt no fear. He only felt a heavy, unbreakable purpose. He twisted the throttle, steering his heavy chopper away from the cracked highway, and turning directly toward the harsh, empty dirt roads. He was heading straight for the old copper mines. He was heading deep into the dry, burning heart of the desert, ready to face the violent ghosts of the past. The transition from the dying, rusted town of Blackwood to the completely dead, unforgiving desert was incredibly sudden. One moment, Cole Bennett was riding his heavy black chopper past the last few crumbling, abandoned gas stations, and the very next moment, he was entirely swallowed by a vast, empty wasteland. The cracked, ruined asphalt of the old county highway quickly surrendered to a narrow, treacherous road of loose white gravel. The heavy, vibrating tires of his motorcycle kicked up a massive, blinding cloud of thick dust, marking his violent path across the lonely landscape. The Texas sun, now burning high and fiercely in the pale sky, beat down heavily upon his broad shoulders. It was a brutal physical weight pressing against his dark leather vest, turning the hot air into a suffocating, unbreathable furnace. Riding 30 miles deep into the arid, sun-baked canyons was a foolish, highly dangerous endeavor for any normal man. There were absolutely no road signs out here. There were no friendly houses, no passing cars, and absolutely no reliable water sources. If a vehicle broke down in this desolate, empty expanse, the harsh elements would easily claim a life long before anyone even noticed the absence. The landscape was a cruel, jagged sea of sharp red rocks, dead, twisting mesquite bushes, and deep, dry ravines carved by ancient, long-forgotten floods. The intense heat waves violently distorted the horizon, making the distant, towering cliffs look like they were constantly shifting and melting into the bright white sky. It felt like riding straight into the very mouth of a massive burning oven. But Cole did not feel the terrible blistering heat. He did not feel the stinging dry dust coating his thick beard, and he did not feel the painful sharp vibrations of the heavy engine traveling up his thick arms. His mind was completely, entirely insulated by a cold, dark, and absolute focus. He was a man riding toward a final violent reckoning, driven by the heavy, screaming ghosts of his past. The terrifying image of that empty wooden porch and the slightly open, rusted metal mailbox played on a constant, relentless loop in his tired mind. He thought about Martha Vance. He thought about her slow, painful walk, her incredibly fragile frame, and the quiet, fierce dignity in her sharp eyes. He imagined her trapped in the terrifying dark, surrounded by ruthless, violent men, completely alone in her final hours. That dark, horrifying thought acted like high-octane fuel burning fiercely in his chest. He pushed the heavy throttle harder, forcing the massive, roaring engine to its absolute limits. He was not a trained soldier, and he was not a brave, noble hero. He was just a deeply broken, heavily flawed mechanic, carrying a massive mountain of unforgivable guilt. He knew he could never bring his younger brother Sam back from the cold earth. He knew he could never fully repair the deep, painful damage he had done to his estranged daughter. But he could do this. He could ride into the absolute worst, most dangerous place on earth, and he could forcefully pull that fragile old woman back from the dark edge. This was his one final chance at a small, bloody piece of redemption. After 40 grueling, agonizing minutes of riding through the blinding heat, the harsh terrain suddenly began to violently change. The narrow, winding dirt road began to steeply climb, weaving dangerously through a series of sharp, jagged canyons. Massive, towering mounds of loose gray rock began to appear on the side of the treacherous path. These were the giant dead slag heaps, the massive piles of useless rock dug out of the earth decades ago. Cole knew he was finally getting close. He slowed the heavy motorcycle down. The engine dropping from a loud, aggressive scream to a low, heavy rumble. A few miles later, the old Anaconda copper mines finally revealed themselves. It was a massive, terrifying monument to human greed, completely abandoned to the harsh elements. The site was built into the very side of a massive, steep canyon wall. There were towering, rusted metal structures jutting violently into the white sky, looking like the skeletal remains of some giant dead beast. There were massive, rotting warehouses built from cheap corrugated iron, their roofs heavily collapsed under the weight of time. There were deep, black, terrifying shafts dropping straight down into the cold, completely silent earth. The entire massive complex was surrounded by a high, rusted chain-link fence topped with brittle, decaying barbed wire. Cole knew that sound would carry for miles in this empty, silent basin. If he rode the loud, heavy chopper all the way up to the broken main gates, the violent men inside would hear him coming long before he ever saw them. He needed the element of absolute, deadly surprise. He aggressively squeezed the heavy handbrake, bringing the motorcycle to a slow, quiet stop near the deep edge of a dry, rocky ravine about a mile away from the main complex. He turned the silver ignition key, completely killing the heavy engine. The sudden absolute silence of the deep desert instantly crashed down upon him. It was a heavy, dead quiet, broken only by the faint, dry rustle of the hot wind moving through the dead brush. He stepped off the heavy bike, using his thick boots to carefully push it deeper down into the dry ditch, completely hiding it from the main dirt road. He quickly gathered a few large, dead, thorny branches, throwing them over the shining chrome of the exhaust pipes, ensuring the sun would not reflect off the metal. He checked his heavy steel revolver one more time, making absolutely sure the heavy cylinder turned smoothly. He tucked it firmly back into his thick leather belt. He took a long, slow drink from a warm plastic water bottle, splashing a little bit of the hot water onto his dusty face. Then he began the long, punishing walk toward the rotting buildings. Walking through the desert in heavy, thick leather boots and a heavy, dark vest was absolute physical torture. The dry, loose gravel shifted constantly under his heavy feet, making every single step a difficult, exhausting effort. He moved incredibly slowly, sticking closely to the sharp, dark shadows cast by the deep canyon walls. He kept his dark eyes moving, constantly scanning the high, rusted towers and the dark, broken windows of the massive warehouses. He was looking for a sentry, a lookout posted high above the ground. But the cartel men clearly felt completely safe out here. They believed they were entirely alone, completely invisible to the outside world. As Cole silently approached the main rusted entrance of the facility, he noticed the heavy chain-link gates had been violently smashed open. The thick steel chain that had once locked them was completely shattered, lying broken in the dry dirt. He carefully stepped through the wide gap, entering the silent industrial graveyard. He used the massive rotting husks of old mining trucks and the giant rusted gears of broken machinery for solid cover. He moved like a heavy, dark ghost, slipping silently from one patch of shade to the next, his breathing slow, controlled, and completely silent. He navigated through a complex maze of old collapsing sheds, heading toward the largest, most intact warehouse sitting near the very back of the deep canyon. And then he finally saw it. Parked carefully behind a massive, towering pile of rusted metal pipes, completely hidden from the main access road, was the black Chevy Suburban. Cole instantly froze, pressing his heavy back flat against the hot, rusted metal of a nearby storage tank. He slowly peeked around the curved hot iron. The large, heavy vehicle matched Harlan's terrified description perfectly. It was a massive, dark machine, completely out of place in this bright, dusty wasteland. The heavy tires were heavily coated in fresh, white desert dust, but the dark, tinted windows were completely opaque, reflecting only the harsh, bright glare of the Texas sun. He waited in the hot shadow for 5 long, agonizing minutes, watching the silent vehicle intently. There was absolutely no movement inside the truck. There was no one standing guard outside. He carefully stepped out from his cover, moving silently across the open, sun-baked dirt. He approached the heavy hood of the dark Suburban, slowly reaching out with his thick, calloused hand. He gently rested his palm against the dark metal of the hood. It was incredibly hot from the sun, but the heavy engine block underneath was entirely cold. They had not just arrived. They had been here for hours. A fresh, terrifying wave of cold dread washed over Cole. Hours was an absolute eternity in the hands of violent, ruthless men. He turned away from the cold vehicle, his dark eyes locking onto the massive corrugated metal warehouse standing just a few yards away. The building was enormous, its faded peeling paint reading "Hazardous Materials" in large block letters. The massive main sliding doors were pulled completely shut, secured by a heavy rusted metal bar. But near the far dark corner of the massive building, there was a small, heavy steel personnel door. Cole moved silently toward the small door. As he got closer, he noticed that the heavy steel door was not entirely closed. It was left slightly ajar, propped open just a tiny fraction of an inch by a small, dirty rock, likely to let in some air for the suffocating men inside. Cole pressed his large body flat against the hot, corrugated metal wall right next to the slight opening. He stopped breathing entirely, focusing all of his senses on the dark, narrow crack. At first, he heard absolutely nothing, just the ringing in his own tired ears. But then, drifting softly through the heavy, stale air, coming from inside the dark warehouse, he heard it. It was a voice. It was a low, harsh, impatient man's voice, echoing faintly in the massive, empty space. And then, underneath that harsh, violent sound, he heard a completely different noise. It was a soft, sudden scrape of a heavy wooden chair moving against a concrete floor. She was in there. The fragile, quiet woman from the yellow house was sitting in the terrifying dark, surrounded by the violent monsters of her son's past. Cole slowly drew the heavy, cold steel revolver from his thick leather belt. He gripped the heavy handle incredibly tight, his knuckles turning completely white. The agonizing wait was over. The time for silent observation and quiet nods was completely gone. It was time to introduce these violent men to the heavy, unforgiving consequences of breaking the rules of his town. Cole pressed his face carefully against the hot, corrugated metal, bringing his right eye right up to the narrow, dark crack in the door. The heavy, stifling air inside the massive warehouse leaked out, hitting his face like a physical wave. It smelled of old, dry rust, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp, bitter scent of human fear. His dark eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, dusty light inside the cavernous space. The massive warehouse was mostly empty, filled only with giant, silent shadows and broken, discarded machinery. But exactly in the very center of the large concrete floor, directly under a single harsh, bright yellow work light, the terrible scene was fully illuminated. Sitting alone in the center of that harsh spotlight was Martha Vance. She was tied tightly to a heavy wooden chair, her thin wrists bound securely behind her back with thick black plastic zip ties. Her fragile ankles were tied firmly to the front legs of the chair. Her faded floral print dress was heavily coated in white desert dust, torn slightly at the shoulder. Her gray hair, usually kept so neat, was messy and wild, clinging to her sweaty forehead. There was a dark purple bruise forming high on her left cheekbone, and a thin, dried trail of dark blood ran from the corner of her pale lips. To any casual observer, she looked completely broken, a helpless, tragic victim waiting for the end. But Cole looked much closer. He saw the tight, rigid set of her thin jaw. He saw her back completely straight, refusing to slump against the hard wood. And he saw her sharp, clear eyes. They were not filled with blind panic. They were filled with a cold, fierce, unyielding defiance. Surrounding her, lingering just at the edge of the bright light, were 3 men. They did not look like cheap local thugs. They did not look angry, chaotic, or out of control. And that is exactly what made them so incredibly dangerous. They were dressed in dark, expensive clothes, completely inappropriate for the brutal Texas heat, yet they hardly seemed to sweat. They moved with a calm, heavy, terrifying purpose. They were professional predators, men who handled violence like a boring daily job. One man, thick and heavily muscled, stood near the back, his arms crossed over his wide chest, simply watching the dark shadows. A second man leaned casually against a rusted metal barrel, slowly tossing a sharp, heavy pocket knife from hand to hand, the metal blade catching the bright light. The third man stood directly in front of Martha. He was the unquestioned leader. He was tall, thin, and moved with a terrifying, smooth grace. He had cold, completely dead black eyes, the kind of eyes that looked right through a human soul. Running from the bottom of his left ear all the way down his neck, disappearing under his dark collar, was a thick, jagged white scar. He stared down at the frail old woman, his face completely blank, entirely devoid of any human empathy. "We are wasting highly valuable time, Mrs. Vance," the scarred man said. His voice was surprisingly quiet, very smooth, and incredibly polite, which made it sound completely terrifying in the empty warehouse. "It is incredibly hot out here. You are an older woman. Your heart cannot handle this kind of intense, prolonged stress. Let us make this easy. Where is the brass key?" Martha did not flinch, and she did not look away from his dead eyes. She took a slow, rattling breath, her fragile chest rising and falling heavily. "I have told you over and over again," she whispered, her voice weak but completely steady. "I do not know what you are talking about. My son is dead. He died 6 long years ago. He left me absolutely nothing except for a broken heart." The scarred man let out a soft, dry chuckle. It was a cold, humorless sound. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his dark jacket, pulling out a small, heavy silver lighter. He flipped the metal lid open and closed a sharp, metallic click, echoing loudly in the silent room. "Please, Mrs. Vance," he said, taking a slow step closer to her chair, "do not insult our intelligence. Tommy was a thief, yes, but he was a very smart, very organized thief. He skimmed millions of dollars from very powerful, very unforgiving people. He hid the master ledger, and he hid the stolen money. We know for an absolute fact that he drove to your house on the very night he died. We know he gave you the key to a safety deposit box. We just need the physical key, and we need the location." He leaned down, placing his hands firmly on the wooden armrests of her chair, trapping her inside his dark shadow. His face was only inches away from hers. "Give us the key, Martha, and we will simply walk away. You can go back to your quiet, lonely house. You can go back to watering your dead grass." Martha looked up at him, her sharp eyes cutting right through his empty promises. She knew the absolute truth. She knew that the second she told them where the hidden key was, she would be completely useless to them. She knew they would put a bullet in her head and leave her rotting in this dark, abandoned mine. She had accepted her terrible fate the very moment they kicked her front door down. But she was not going to give them the satisfaction of begging. "You boys think you are the very first ones to come looking for his ghosts?" Martha asked, a faint, bitter edge of defiance cutting sharply through her deep exhaustion. "You do not understand what you have stepped into. Tommy is gone. The money is gone. You are completely wasting your time on a dead empty end." The man tossing the heavy pocket knife suddenly stopped stepping forward into the harsh light. "You are pushing it, old lady," he snapped, his voice harsh, impatient, and angry. "Tell us where it is right now." The scarred man held up a thin hand, silencing his aggressive partner. He looked down at Martha, his dead eyes narrowing slightly, studying her worn face. He finally realized that fear was not going to work. He realized he was not dealing with a frightened, confused victim. He was dealing with a deeply hardened survivor. "I understand money, Mrs. Vance," the scarred man said, his smooth voice dropping to a dangerous, heavy whisper. "And I understand human nature. You have been sitting on this valuable information for 6 long years. You have lived in absolute constant fear, waiting for us to finally arrive in the dark. Nobody waits that long. Nobody suffers that much, for absolutely nothing. So let us stop pretending you are just a helpless, ignorant mother." Outside the heavy metal door, Cole stood completely frozen, his heart hammering a violent, rapid beat against his ribs. He listened to her frail, determined voice, and he felt a massive wave of pure, absolute awe wash over him. He was a large, strong man, built for violence and endurance, but he knew he did not possess half the raw courage of this tiny, battered woman. She was staring directly into the terrifying face of death, completely outnumbered, entirely helpless, and yet she completely refused to break. She was holding the heavy line, protecting her son's final dark secret with her own fragile life. Cole suddenly thought about his younger brother, Sam. He remembered how easily Sam had folded, how quickly Sam had surrendered to the dark pressure of violent men. He remembered his own cowardice, his own pathetic refusal to face the heavy danger when it mattered most. But looking through that narrow crack, watching Martha Vance fight her quiet, terrifying war, Cole found his own shattered resolve. She was not just a stranger anymore. She was a bright, shining light in a very dark, cowardly world. And he was absolutely not going to let them extinguish that light. The scarred man sighed heavily, clearly annoyed by her stubborn silence. He stood up straight, turning his back on Martha. He looked directly at the thick, muscular man, standing quietly in the dark shadows. The scarred man gave a slow, single, terrifying nod. "Fine," the scarred man said, his voice entirely devoid of any emotion. "If she wants to play the protective, loyal mother, let her. We do not need her to talk right now. We just need her to scream. Break her fingers, one by one. Take your time." The muscular man smiled a cruel, ugly expression. He stepped slowly out of the dark shadows, reaching into his back pocket, pulling out a heavy steel pair of thick pliers. He walked slowly toward the wooden chair, the metal tool gleaming brightly under the harsh worklight. Martha finally squeezed her eyes tightly shut, her breathing hitching slightly in her chest, bracing herself for the sudden, blinding agony. Outside, the agonizing wait was absolutely over. The time for sneaking, the time for watching was completely done. Cole took one long, deep, silent breath, filling his large lungs with the hot, stale desert air. He gripped the heavy handle of his steel revolver incredibly tight, his thumb pulling back the heavy metal hammer with a soft, deadly click. He took one step back from the corrugated metal wall. He raised his massive, heavy leather boot, aiming directly at the center of the small steel door. He was not going to let them touch her again. Cole's heavy leather boot struck the solid steel door with the massive, unstoppable force of a speeding freight train. The rusted metal frame completely shattered under the violent impact. The heavy door flew violently open, crashing loudly against the corrugated iron wall, sending a massive, deafening shockwave echoing through the silent, dusty warehouse. It sounded exactly like a heavy bomb detonating in the stale, dead air. Inside the dim, hot room, the sudden explosive noise completely shattered the terrifying, quiet tension. The three professional cartel men, entirely unprepared for a violent, chaotic ambush in the absolute middle of a dead desert, froze completely for a single fatal split second. Cole stepped rapidly through the doorway, his massive frame filling the narrow entrance. His dark, tired eyes were wide, completely focused, locking instantly onto the most immediate dangerous threat. The thick, muscular man, holding the heavy steel pliers, was standing right next to Martha. He turned his heavy head, his cruel, ugly smile instantly vanishing. His wide eyes registered the large, heavily tattooed biker stepping violently out of the dark desert shadows. Cole did not yell. He did not issue a polite warning, and he certainly did not ask the violent men to surrender. He raised his heavy steel revolver, his thick finger gripping the cold metal, and he violently squeezed the heavy trigger. The deafening explosive roar of the large gun was absolutely terrifying inside the enclosed metal walls. It was a massive concussive wave of pure violent sound, aggressively rattling the broken windows and fiercely shaking the thick white dust from the rotting rafters above. A bright orange flash of hot fire violently lit up the dark corner of the room. The heavy lead bullet struck the muscular man perfectly squarely in his broad, thick chest. The sheer kinetic impact of the heavy round lifted his thick boots completely off the hard concrete floor. His heavy body was thrown violently backward, crashing heavily into the dark shadows, completely broken. The heavy steel pliers clattered loudly against the stone, entirely useless now. Before the loud ringing echo of the very first shot could even begin to fade, the dark warehouse erupted into absolute chaotic violence. The second man, the one who had been casually tossing the sharp pocket knife, reacted with terrifying professional speed. He did not freeze, and he did not panic. He dropped the small knife, his hand instantly reaching beneath his dark tailored jacket, drawing a sleek black semi-automatic pistol. He raised the dark weapon, aiming the cold barrel directly at Cole's chest. But Cole was already moving. He was a massive, heavy man, but the pure, burning adrenaline and his desperate, violent need to protect the old woman made him incredibly fast. He threw his large body hard to the left, diving forcefully behind a large, rusted metal storage tank. A rapid, deafening burst of loud gunfire violently tore through the stale air. The sharp, high-pitched crack of the modern pistol sharply contrasted with the deep, heavy boom of Cole's old revolver. Hot, heavy lead sparks showered forcefully down over Cole's head as the incoming bullets slammed violently against the thick, rusted metal of the tank. The deadly bullets whined sharply, aggressively, ricocheting into the dark metal roof. Cole pressed his heavy, sweating back tightly against the hot metal tank. His heart was hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against his ribcage. His breath came in short, ragged, heavy gasps. He could smell the sharp, acrid scent of burnt cordite, heavily mixing with the old, dry dust of the dead mine. He peeked quickly around the curved, rusted edge of the metal tank. The man with the pistol was advancing rapidly, moving tactically across the open concrete floor, using the heavy wooden crates for solid, reliable cover. He was actively trying to flank Cole, trying to trap the large biker in a dangerous, deadly crossfire. And somewhere quietly hiding in the dark, shifting shadows was the scarred leader. Cole had entirely lost sight of him in the sudden, blinding chaos. That was the most terrifying, dangerous thought. Cole knew he could not stay safely hidden. He could not wait for them to close the distance, and he could not let them control the fight. He had to keep the violent attention focused entirely on himself, actively drawing their deadly fire completely away from the fragile, helpless old woman tied to the chair. He took a deep, heavy breath, completely filling his large lungs. He gripped the heavy revolver incredibly tight, and he stepped swiftly out from behind his metal cover, completely exposing his massive frame to the bright, harsh yellow light. The advancing man quickly raised his dark pistol again, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Cole fired first. The heavy revolver roared a second time, the loud explosion shaking the floor. The heavy shot went slightly wide, violently striking the heavy wooden crate directly in front of the advancing man. A massive explosive shower of sharp wooden splinters erupted forcefully into the air violently, tearing into the man's dark jacket, forcing him to duck his head in sudden sharp pain. Cole did not stop, and he did not hesitate. He fired a third time the heavy, violent recoil, pushing forcefully against his thick, calloused palm. The heavy bullet found its perfect mark, striking the man directly in the right shoulder. The dark pistol spun violently out of the man's hand, clattering loudly across the dirty concrete. The man cried out a sharp, sudden sound of intense pain, falling heavily to his knees, grasping his profusely bleeding shoulder tightly. 2 down. Only 1 left. Suddenly, a sharp, burning agony violently ripped through Cole's left side. A quiet, sharp crack echoed from the far, dark corner of the massive warehouse. The scarred leader had silently, patiently circled around the heavy, broken machinery. He was standing completely still in the deep black shadows, holding a long, dark, suppressed handgun. He had fired a single incredibly precise, deadly shot. The heavy bullet grazed deeply along Cole's heavy ribs, violently tearing completely through his thick, dark leather vest, heavily burning his thick skin. It felt exactly like a hot, jagged knife dragging forcefully across his chest. Cole stumbled backward, his heavy boots slipping slightly on the dusty, blood-stained concrete. He fell hard onto his right knee, letting out a low, heavy, agonizing grunt of deep pain. He pressed his thick left hand tightly against his bleeding side, feeling the hot, wet blood soaking quickly into his torn, dirty shirt. "You are a very foolish, very brave man," the scarred leader said. His smooth, calm voice drifted eerily out of the dark, cold shadow, sounding entirely unaffected by the chaotic, bloody violence around him. "But raw bravery is completely useless against careful preparation. Drop the heavy gun, biker. Do it right now, or I will put the very next bullet directly into her gray head." Cole looked up, his dark eyes squinting through the painful sweat. He looked toward the center of the bright light. Martha was still tied securely to the heavy wooden chair. She was completely trapped, entirely unable to move, unable to run. The scarred leader slowly stepped out of the dark hiding shadows, stopping right behind her. He raised his dark, suppressed handgun, pressing the cold black metal barrel directly against the back of her messy gray hair. It was a terrifying, completely impossible standoff. The heavy ringing in Cole's ears was deafening. The burning, sharp pain in his side was intense and heavily distracting. He was bleeding. He was exhausted. And he was completely out of safe options. "Drop it," the scarred leader commanded again, his completely dead eyes locking directly onto Cole's dark, sweating face. "I will absolutely not ask you a third time." Cole knelt heavily on the hard, unyielding concrete. He looked at the heavy steel revolver in his trembling right hand. He had exactly 3 heavy bullets left. He looked at the smooth, scarred man standing securely behind the old woman, using her frail, tiny body as a complete human shield. It was a completely impossible, highly dangerous shot. If his heavy hand shook even a fraction of an inch, if the heavy bullet drifted slightly off its true course, he would instantly kill the very person he came to desperately save. He looked directly into Martha's sharp, clear eyes. He fully expected to see absolute blinding terror. He expected to see a desperate silent plea begging him to drop the gun, begging him to surrender to the violent men. But Martha Vance did not beg. She stared fiercely and tensely right back at him. She did not cry, and she did not shake. Slowly, deliberately, she gave him that familiar, tiny, subtle nod. It was the exact same powerful nod she gave him every single morning on the dusty, cracked street. It was a silent, deep communication. It was a powerful, undeniable message of pure trust and raw, unbreakable defiance. She was telling him to take the impossible shot. She was telling him to finish the fight. Cole took one slow, incredibly deep breath, completely filling his large lungs, steadying his violently racing heart. He firmly pushed the burning pain entirely out of his mind. He forcefully stopped the heavy trembling in his thick hand. He remembered the exact calm feeling of rebuilding a broken dead engine, the pure cold logic of fitting the precise pieces together. He became a cold, completely focused, violent machine. He did not lower the heavy gun. He raised it slightly, his dark, sharp eyes staring directly down the heavy steel sights, locking onto the dark target. The scarred leader's dead eyes widened in sudden, absolute shock. He realized a fraction of a second too late that this broken, solitary biker was not going to surrender to the dark. He began to forcefully pull the heavy trigger of his dark gun. Cole squeezed his heavy finger. The heavy revolver roared for the fourth time. It was the loudest, most deafening sound of the entire brutal day. The bright orange flash momentarily blinded Cole's tired eyes. The heavy lead bullet sailed rapidly through the dusty hot air. It passed mere inches from Martha's right cheek, the sheer violent wind of the heavy bullet forcefully blowing her gray hair to the side. The heavy bullet struck the scarred leader perfectly squarely in the absolute center of his forehead. The smooth, terrifying man did not scream. He did not say another arrogant word. His cold, dead eyes simply rolled completely back into his head. His tall, thin body went completely limp, violently collapsing backward onto the hard concrete floor, landing heavily in the dark dust. The dark, suppressed handgun slipped completely from his lifeless fingers, clattering loudly, harmlessly into the quiet room. The sudden, massive violence ended just as quickly as it had violently begun. The heavy, deafening echoes of the final gunshot slowly faded away, rolling out into the vast, empty desert outside. The thick white dust settled slowly back down from the rotting rafters, drifting lazily through the bright yellow beam of the work light. Cole remained heavily on his knees for a long, quiet minute, the heavy steel revolver still pointed firmly at the dark shadows, breathing heavily in the sudden absolute silence. The heavy ringing silence that followed the final gunshot felt incredibly thick, almost like a physical weight pressing down on the dark, dusty room. Cole Bennett remained heavily on his knees for a long, quiet moment. His chest heaved violently, pulling the stale, acrid air deep into his burning lungs. He kept the heavy steel revolver raised, his dark eyes darting rapidly across the shadowy, cavernous warehouse. He watched the thick, muscular man lying broken in the dark corner. He watched the second man, bleeding heavily on the dirty concrete, completely unconscious from the severe, massive trauma. And finally, his tired eyes locked onto the scarred leader, lying perfectly still in the dry, white dust as dark, cruel rain permanently, violently ended. There was absolutely no movement. There were no sudden hidden threats emerging from the deep, rusted shadows. The brutal, desperate fight was completely over. Slowly, agonizingly, Cole forced his massive body to move. He planted his heavy, scuffed leather boot firmly on the hard concrete floor, and he pushed himself upward. As soon as he stood up straight, a sharp, blinding wave of pure agony violently ripped through his left side. The deep, bloody graze along his heavy ribs flared up, burning fiercely, like a hot, jagged wire, pulled tightly across his thick skin. He gritted his teeth, a low, heavy groan escaping his dark beard. He instinctively pressed his large, calloused hand against his torn, bloody shirt, feeling the warm, sticky wetness seeping heavily through the thick fabric. It was a painful, highly dangerous wound, but it was not fatal. He had survived the dark, terrible storm. He slowly lowered the heavy revolver, his thumb carefully guiding the heavy metal hammer back into its safe resting position. He shoved the hot, smoking weapon securely back into his thick leather belt. He took a slow, unsteady step forward, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the sharp, broken glass, and the empty brass shell casing scattered completely across the dirty floor. He walked directly into the bright, harsh yellow beam of the overhead work light. He walked directly toward Martha Vance. Martha was still sitting entirely upright in the heavy wooden chair. Her thin, frail body was completely rigid, her sharp eyes wide, staring at the massive, heavily tattooed man standing right in front of her. She had just witnessed an incredibly brutal, terrifying display of absolute violence, an explosion of blood and noise that would have completely shattered most people. Yet as Cole looked deeply into her weathered, bruised face, he did not see absolute, blinding terror. He saw a profound, heavy shock, yes, but he also saw a deep, overwhelming wave of pure, absolute relief. Cole reached carefully into the deep pocket of his dark jeans, pulling out his heavy folding work knife. He flipped the sharp steel blade open with a soft metallic click. He stepped entirely behind the wooden chair, moving slowly, deliberately, not wanting to frighten her with sudden aggressive movements. He gently took hold of her thin, fragile wrists, pulling the sharp edge of the blade carefully against the thick, black plastic zip ties. The tough plastic snapped loudly, suddenly releasing her bruised, swollen hands. He quickly knelt down on the hard concrete, ignoring the sharp, burning pain in his side, and carefully cut the tight bonds holding her fragile ankles to the heavy chair legs. "You are completely free, ma'am," Cole said, his deep, rough voice, surprisingly gentle, incredibly soft in the quiet, echoing warehouse. "They cannot hurt you anymore. It is completely over." Martha slowly brought her trembling, bruised hands forward, resting them gently on her lap. She carefully rubbed her raw, red wrists, wincing slightly at the deep, painful marks left by the cruel plastic. She took a long, slow, deep breath, closing her eyes for just a fleeting, quiet second, letting the heavy, terrifying reality of her survival finally settle into her fragile bones. Then she slowly pushed herself up from the heavy wooden chair. Her thin legs were incredibly weak, shaking violently from the intense, prolonged stress and the brutal Texas heat. She swayed slightly, almost losing her delicate balance. Cole immediately reached out his massive, blood-stained hands, gently catching her thin, fragile shoulders, steadying her frail frame. He held her carefully, treating her like a delicate, incredibly precious piece of shattered glass. "Take it incredibly slow," Cole whispered, looking down into her pale face. "You have been through absolute hell today. Just breathe." Martha looked up at him, her sharp, clear eyes slowly tracing the hard, weathered lines of his tired face. She looked at his thick, dark beard, his heavily tattooed arms, and the dark, wet blood soaking heavily into his torn shirt. He looked like a rough, dangerous monster, a violent phantom from a dark, forgotten world. But to her, standing in the bright, harsh light of that terrible room, he was the absolute most beautiful, comforting sight she had ever seen. "You are hurt," Martha said, her fragile voice cracking slightly, filled with a deep maternal concern. She gently raised her thin, trembling hand, pointing weakly at the dark, blooming stain on his heavy side. "You are bleeding terribly." Cole simply shook his large head, offering a small, tired, dismissive nod. "It is just a scratch, ma'am. Do not worry about me. I am built incredibly tough. Are you severely injured? Did they break anything?" "No," Martha replied softly, gently, touching the dark, ugly bruise swelling violently on her cheekbone. "They hit me and they frightened me deeply, but I am entirely in one piece. Thanks to you." She slowly turned her gray head, looking out into the dark, silent shadows of the massive warehouse. She looked at the lifeless body of the scarred leader, lying completely still in the dry dust. She looked at the other two violent men, broken and defeated. She had lived in absolute, constant, paralyzing fear of these dark, ruthless phantoms for 6 long, agonizing years. They had haunted her quiet nights, they had stolen her precious peace, and they had violently taken her only son. But now, seeing them completely destroyed, reduced to nothing but silent, bleeding heaps on a dirty concrete floor, the massive, crushing weight of that terrible fear finally lifted entirely off her thin shoulders. "They are really gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible, sounding almost like a quiet, disbelieving prayer. "They are finally, truly gone. They will never ever come back to Blackwood." Cole confirmed, his deep voice filled with absolute dark certainty. "You never have to look over your shoulder again. The dark past is completely buried." Martha slowly turned her attention completely back to Cole. She looked at him with an intense, piercing curiosity, a deep, probing stare that seemed to look right through his rough, hardened exterior. The terrifying adrenaline was slowly fading entirely, replaced by a heavy, profound emotional truth. They were completely alone in the silent desert. Two isolated, forgotten ghosts who had just survived an absolute violent nightmare together. "You did not even know my name," Martha said, her voice growing slightly stronger, echoing softly in the large room. "You did not know anything about me. You did not know about my terrible son. You did not know about the stolen money. And you did not know about these violent, dangerous men. I was just an old, fading woman standing by a rusted metal mailbox." Cole slowly nodded, the heavy, painful memory of his younger brother Sam suddenly flaring up brightly in his tired mind. "I knew you were there," Cole said simply, his dark eyes dropping heavily to the dirty floor. "I knew your pattern. I knew you never ever missed a single morning, and I knew that when a reliable, steady pattern suddenly breaks in the dark, it usually means something terrible has happened." Martha took a slow, painful step closer to him, her thin hand reaching out gently, resting her small fingers lightly against his thick, muscular forearm. It was the very first time they had ever physically touched a fragile human connection in a completely brutal, violent place. "You came completely alone," she continued, her sharp eyes shining with unshed heavy tears. "You rode straight into the deep, empty desert. Completely outnumbered, facing professional, ruthless killers. You risked your own life. You took a heavy bullet entirely for a complete stranger." Cole looked back up at her, his jaw clenching tightly under his dark beard. The massive, heavy wall of protective guilt he had built around his heart for so many years felt incredibly fragile right now. "I am not a hero, ma'am," he whispered, his rough voice breaking slightly heavily thick with old dark emotion. "I am a deeply broken man. Years ago I failed to notice when someone I loved deeply was in terrible danger. I looked away. I ignored the clear signs, and it cost him his entire life. I promised myself I would never ever be that blind again. When your porch was empty, I knew exactly what it meant. I could not simply drive away. Not again. Never again." Martha listened to his painful, raw confession, her sharp eyes softening with a deep, profound empathy. She understood heavy guilt. She understood the terrible, agonizing burden of loving someone who was lost to the dark. She gently squeezed his thick arm, offering a silent, powerful comfort. "Well, you were not blind this time," Martha said softly. Her voice filled with absolute, undeniable truth. "You saw me. You were the absolutely only person in that entire blind town who actually saw me. And because you kept your eyes wide open, I am still alive." Cole felt a sudden strange tightness completely seize his heavy chest. It was not the sharp pain of his bleeding wound. It was something entirely different. It was the strange, unfamiliar, overwhelming feeling of actual, genuine peace. He had spent years aggressively punishing himself, living in absolute dark isolation, firmly believing his soul was entirely permanently stained. But looking at this frail, unbroken woman standing safely in the harsh light, he felt the heavy ghost of his brother finally slowly begin to step back into the dark shadows. He had not saved Sam, but he had saved her. And in saving her, he realized he might have finally saved a small, fragile piece of his own shattered soul. "Come on," Cole said gently, breaking the heavy emotional silence, offering her his thick, uninjured arm for support. "It is incredibly hot in here, and we need to get far away from this terrible place. Let me take you home, Martha." A full week had slowly passed since the violent, terrifying nightmare in the deep desert. On the quiet surface, the dying town of Blackwood, Texas, looked exactly the same. The brutal, unforgiving sun still beat down heavily on the cracked, ruined asphalt. The stray dogs still hid deep in the dark shadows, and the hot, dry wind still blew the white dust across the empty, silent streets. But inside the fading yellow house at the very edge of town, the entire world had fundamentally, completely shifted. The heavy, suffocating shadow of absolute fear, the dark cloud that Martha Vance had carried on her thin shoulders for 6 long years, was finally entirely gone. Cole Bennett had driven her back to town that terrible day. They had left the broken, dark warehouse behind them, leaving the violent men to the silent desert. Cole had made a quiet, anonymous phone call from a dusty payphone outside a distant truck stop, giving the local police just enough vague information to find the abandoned mines. He knew the corrupt authorities and the cartel fixers would quickly clean up their own dark mess. They would sweep the violent failure completely under the rug, and they would never ever look at the quiet elderly widow again. The dark past was finally permanently buried in the dry dirt. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The heavy wooden front door of the fading yellow house slowly opened. Cole had come by 3 days ago, bringing his heavy steel tools. He had quietly fixed the shattered wooden doorframe, installing a brand new heavy brass lock. He did not ask for any money, and Martha did not offer any. Some debts are far too heavy to ever be paid with cheap paper bills. Martha stepped out onto her old, groaning wooden porch. The dark purple bruise on her fragile cheekbone was slowly turning a dull, faded yellow, but her worn face was completely relaxed. For the very first time in over 2,000 days, she did not step outside like a frightened, hunted animal. She did not nervously scan the long, empty street for dark, unmarked cars. She did not listen for the terrifying, heavy footsteps of violent strangers. She simply stood on her porch, closing her sharp eyes, and took a long, deep breath of the hot, dusty morning air. It tasted incredibly sweet. It tasted like absolute, undeniable freedom. She began her slow, deliberate walk down the cracked concrete path. Her worn leather shoes scuffed softly against the loose gravel. But this walk was no longer a desperate, highly calculated alarm system. It was no longer a terrifying, fragile trap set for her own survival. Today, it was just a quiet, simple morning walk. She reached the very end of her dry dirt driveway, resting her thin, trembling hand lightly on the hot, rusted metal of her old mailbox. She stood there in the bright Texas sun, and she quietly waited. A few blocks away, The deep guttural roar of a massive motorcycle violently tore through the heavy morning silence. The sound echoed loudly off the empty, ruined storefronts. Cole Bennett came riding slowly around the familiar bend of Elm Street. He was wearing a brand new dark leather vest. Underneath the heavy leather, and underneath his dark cotton shirt, his thick ribs were wrapped tightly in thick white medical bandages. The deep burning bullet wound still hurt terribly with every single breath he took. But as he looked down the long, shimmering road and saw the small, fragile figure standing by the rusted mailbox, the sharp physical pain entirely faded away. Cole eased off the heavy throttle, letting the massive black chopper glide slowly toward the fading yellow house. He did not look at her with dark, heavy suspicion anymore. He looked at her with a profound, deep, undeniable respect. As he rolled past the edge of her dry lawn, the loud engine thumping a heavy, steady rhythm, Cole slowly lifted his left hand from the metal clutch lever. He raised his two thick, calloused fingers into the hot air. Martha looked directly into his dark, tired eyes. She did not just see a rough, solitary, heavily tattooed biker anymore. She saw the brave, broken man who had willingly walked into absolute hell entirely for a complete stranger. The hard, guarded lines around her mouth completely softened. She offered him a small, genuine, incredibly warm smile. She slowly dipped her gray head, returning his familiar, silent nod. It was the exact same quiet ritual they had practiced for weeks. But today, the heavy meaning was entirely different. It was no longer a desperate, silent check for basic survival. It was a deep mutual acknowledgement of profound human connection. It was two isolated, forgotten warriors silently honoring the heavy, bloody battle they had just fought, and completely won together. Cole slowly lowered his thick hand, twisting the heavy throttle, and riding past her quiet house. But today, as he reached the end of Elm Street, he did not turn his heavy bike toward his dark, suffocating mechanic garage. The broken, rusted engines could wait. He had a much more important, deeply personal journey to make. He rode his loud motorcycle all the way to the very edge of the county line, turning onto a narrow, uneven dirt road. The road led to a small, completely forgotten, sun-baked cemetery. The grass here was entirely dead-baked into dry, yellow straw by the unforgiving Texas sun. The old stone markers were heavily weathered, their carved names slowly fading away under the constant blowing dust. Cole parked his heavy bike near the rusted iron gates. He turned off the loud engine, letting the deep, heavy silence of the resting place wash entirely over him. He walked slowly down the narrow dirt paths, his heavy boots crunching softly on the dry earth. He walked until he reached a small, incredibly plain granite headstone, sitting quietly under the thin, broken shade of a dead mesquite tree. He stopped in front of the stone. Carved deeply into the rough gray rock was the name Samuel Bennett. Cole stood there for a very long time. He reached up slowly, pulling his dark sunglasses off his face, exposing his tired, dark eyes to the glaring, bright sun. He had not visited this lonely grave in many, many years. The massive, crushing guilt had always kept him completely away. He had always firmly believed that he did not possess the absolute right to stand here, not after he had failed his younger brother so completely. But today, the heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on his chest was finally truly gone. "I am so incredibly sorry, Sam," Cole whispered, his deep, rough voice breaking slightly in the quiet, hot wind. "I was blind, brother. I was entirely selfish, and I was completely blind. I let you fall into the dark, and I have punished myself for it every single day since." He took a slow, trembling breath, looking down at the dry, dusty earth. "But I finally opened my eyes." Cole continued, his voice growing slightly stronger, filled with a quiet, hard-earned peace. "I saw someone else standing right on the edge of the dark, I paid close attention this time, Sam. I did not look the other way. I stepped into the absolute fire, and I pulled her back out. She is completely safe. And because of her, I think I am finally going to be okay too. He reached out his thick, calloused hand, gently resting his rough fingers against the hot, sun-baked granite of his brother's stone. He finally forgave himself. The terrible bleeding wound in his soul, a wound far deeper and far more painful than any bullet, finally began to close. He stood up straight, putting his dark sunglasses back on. He turned away from the lonely grave, walking back toward his heavy motorcycle, ready to finally start living his life again. When we rush blindly through our busy, chaotic days, it is incredibly easy to treat the quiet people around us like invisible background noise. It is entirely easy to ignore the silent daily routines of the strangers we pass on the street. But this profound emotional story reminds us of a highly fragile, incredibly beautiful truth. We are all deeply, entirely connected. The smallest, most silent gesture, a simple look, a quiet nod, or just taking a single moment to actually see the isolated people around us can carry the massive, heavy weight of an entire life. True survival is rarely about physical strength or fighting violent monsters in the dark. True survival is about simple human attention. It is about proving to each other that we are not completely alone in this vast, overwhelming world. Because sometimes, just knowing that one single quiet person is actually paying close attention to you is enough to save your entire life. And sometimes, stepping out of your own dark shadows to save someone else is exactly how you finally manage to save yourself. Thank you so much for sitting down, taking a deep breath, and sharing this emotional journey with me today. I truly hope this story touched your heart and maybe inspires you to look a little closer at the quiet people in your own neighborhood. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from right now. Please take a quick second to leave a comment down below and tell me the name of the beautiful city you live in. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these deep, meaningful stories together. Take care of yourselves. Keep your eyes wide open, and I will see you in the next one.